Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
Record.
Well, hi, y'all.
Hey, how's your mom and them?
How's your mom and them?
That was good, Chelsea.
Thanks.
You should apply to be a voiceover person for books, like reading books.
I would love that. You know, I've actually had more than a handful of people tell me, like, man, I just love listening to you speak and talk.
Yeah.
So maybe one of these days.
It's right in the stars.
Well, Bailey, what do you have on tap for us today?
So I started this because I kind of took the lead this week for like researching and typing up most of the case. Of course, Chelsea and I like convene before we record so we know what's going on. But I kind of took point this week and I was like, I really want to do a nonviolent crime. Like, I don't have the emotional capacity to do like a serial killer or a hardcore one.
Yeah.
And then ended up with the bottom of the barrel crime. That's like the worst.
Well, so, you know, obviously Bailey and I talk a little bit here and there about cases in the time leading up to it. And Bailey was telling me about what this case is essentially, you know, centered around, the focal point of the case. And I was telling my family at lunch, and you should have seen every single face from like the 44-year-old man that I'm married to down to the, 14-year-old son of mine. Every single person was like, brr? Like,
yeah.
We're like, no, that's no.
It's real bad. It's real bad. And so, just a big fat trigger warning. This episode has to do with pedophiles and child sex abuse. And that is at the center of what is known as the Kentler Experiment. Almost said experience. That was terrible. Experiment. And so that's what we're going to be getting into today.
I think it is, I don't know. I feel like Bailey, it's kind of one of those like, Chelsea, you always say this, but then at the same time, she's like, I mean, I get it. You always say this. I just think it's so important for us to talk about this stuff. I will die on that hill. Like, we've got to talk about this really gritty, awful stuff because, guys, it's out there. Even if it was out there in the past, I mean, I feel like maybe that's the reason why I do love history so much, is because we really can learn from our past mistakes. And like I said, I am always thankful that we can present these really awful cases because I really think they're important to talk about. So put your seatbelts on, everybody, because it's going to be really gnarly.
Yeah. And so, as always, you guys, without further ado, we are going to get into the infamous, yet not widely known in our hemisphere, the Kentler Experiment. So here we go. Now, to kick this off, there are some moments in life that you recognize immediately as a turning point. It could be one of those like dramatic phone calls in the middle of the night, or, you know, all the TV shows or the movies where the doctor walks into the room holding a clipboard and you're like, oh, this isn't good. Sometimes it's hearing a name from a deeply buried memory that jolts you into action. For a man we'll call Marco, one of those moments came in 2015. By this point in time, Marco was well into adulthood. He had built a life of his own. He had become a father despite a really bad childhood. Growing up in West Berlin, Germany, his home life had deteriorated to the point that the government had to intervene and placed him in the foster care system. Like many people who experience childhood trauma, Marco didn't remember his early years as a complete story. He remembered them in bits and pieces: smells, faces, names, feelings. For years, he assumed those fragments were all he would ever have. But again in 2015, one familiar name would force him to confront a past he thought was long behind him and unravel one of the most disturbing child welfare scandals in modern history.
One afternoon in 2015, while browsing online, Marco came across an article about an investigation in Berlin. It was one of those retrospective pieces journalists occasionally write, where it's an investigation into a foster care system scandal that had taken place decades earlier. It was an article that one might read for a few minutes before moving on with your day. Marco almost did exactly that when his eyes landed on the name Fritz Henkel. He stared at the name, wondering if it could possibly be someone else. Fritz Henkel wasn't a politician or celebrity, so not a socially common name. But to Marco, as he kept reading, he realized the name was referring to the person he intuitively in his gut knew the article was referring to. A man from Berlin, the man who raised him. At this point, he didn't know where Fritz Henkel's name appeared in the article he was reading. He only knew that authorities and researchers were looking back at foster care placements that had occurred years earlier. As he searched for more information, he found additional articles, each revealing just enough to deepen the mystery without answering it. Again and again, reporters hinted that this wasn't about one foster home or one questionable placement. Investigators believed they had uncovered something much larger. And what's scary is it was a pattern hidden inside Berlin's child welfare system that had gone unnoticed and unquestioned, for literal decades.
What had started as idle curiosity quickly became something closer to obsession. Marco found himself searching for every article he could find, translating reports, reading interviews with researchers, and trying to piece together a story that felt frustratingly incomplete. Each article hinted at the same thing. Investigators in Berlin had begun reopening foster care records from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. They believed there were some serious questions about how some children had been placed into foster homes, but the reporting, again, rarely explained exactly what those questions were. Now, thinking back, memories began resurfacing for Marco, though they didn't arrive neatly in chronological order as they usually don't. They surfaced as fragments. One fragment was Marco remembering his foster father, Fritz Henkel, as an older man who lived alone. The house he had lived in with Henkel was not especially remarkable, and he remembered the home having a routine, meals, going to school, and all the ordinary days. But what bothered Marco the most wasn't one specific memory, but rather the realization that so much of his childhood felt what we could say was emotionally flat, almost as if a film had been cut and replaced with generic memories or assumptions. And, just kind of as a side note, as a trauma therapist, this is something that really stands out to me because people often come to me and have this expectation that trauma sometimes as like vivid flashbacks or dramatic emotional breakdowns. But a lot of times, people who have been through trauma describe something different. Sometimes they do have the vivid flashbacks and emotional breakdowns, but a lot of the times they talk about the lack thereof, the blank spaces, about feeling disconnected from parts of their own story. And usually a lot of the things that I do is like psychoeducation around like memory loss in the brain and how that's the brain's way of survival. And sometimes, in context of this case, the safest way for a child to endure overwhelming experiences in their world is not only to remember less, but it's also to feel less. And so there's a lot of times there's a looking towards the future. And so you try not to pay attention to the pain in the current moment. And because of that, memories are stored really differently. So it's just kind of a food for thought situation in the context of everything we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, because I imagine that some trauma is stored, like you said, very vividly, but then some is like you were talking about, and the more flat, feeling flat. And for Marco, it was that way. And the more he read, the more he realized he needed more information to fill in the gaps of his childhood memories. He needed someone who knew this investigation better than the newspapers did. So he reached out to one of the researchers who had been studying the case. He figured if anyone could explain why his foster father had suddenly become part of a public investigation, it would be the people digging through the archives themselves. The researcher that Marco contacted, her name was Teresa Nentwig, and she had already spent years doing something most of us would never think to do. And what her role was she was reading old child welfare files by the thousands, digging through files that were filled with court descriptions, psychological evaluations, handwritten notes from social workers, and recommendations from experts. Like I really cannot even imagine how much information and how heavy that job is to go through files like this. And it was tedious work that took thousands of hours to piece together. But when the files had been dissected, that's when Teresa started to notice patterns. Then, when Marco reached out to her, Teresa immediately recognized the significance of his call. She knew Fritz Hinkle's name and therefore knew that if Marco had lived in Hinkle's home, he might possess something no archive could ever have in its existence, and that was memory. They began to collaborate, and Teresa would share what she had found in the government records, and Marco would share the bits and pieces of his memories that hopefully would begin to fill the gaps that the paperwork couldn't. So I feel like, Bailey, it was kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? Like they really both were gaining really good things on a personal and a professional level through this relationship.
Yeah, they were both contributing to this relationship, what the other person offered that they were missing themselves, right? And in the midst of their collaboration, another pattern began to emerge. Scattered throughout the files was another name, Helmut Kentler. When Marco first heard or read the name Helmut Kentler, it didn't really automatically register to him. I mean, why would it? Most people don't remember the names of experts or psychologists or social workers who consult on child welfare cases, especially, 30 years ago. But what they started to find out about Kentler was he was a professor, a psychologist connected to the foster system. And again, this is not terribly unusual, as every child welfare system relies on experts. And there were no obvious reason for this particular guy to really stand out. I mean, that was his job. But Again, his name appeared in almost every single article connected to the Berlin welfare system in those decades. It was as if every path through the archives eventually circled back to the same man. So the big question became, who was Helmut Kentler really? In post-war Germany, Helmut Kentler had become one of the country's best-known voices on child development and sexuality. He was a psychologist, as we know, a professor, as we know, a sexologist, and an author. He lectured at universities, he advised public agencies, appeared in the media, and wrote extensively about education and family life. To many people, he represented a new generation of thinkers trying to reshape German society after the authoritarianism of the Nazi era. Traditional ideas about parenting, discipline, and sexuality were being questioned, and Kentler was among the academics leading those conversations. So by the 1970s, Helmut Kentler was central to all conversations about youth welfare because people believed he understood children. If Kentler had been an unknown outsider making really weird and bizarre claims, it's likely nobody would have listened to him. But as we know, as you outsiders know from all the cases we cover, institutions don't elevate people who are perceived as radicals. They elevate people who are perceived as experts. But despite his expertise, Kentler's name was all over the archives. And again, why? Why was one singular professor connected to so many foster care decisions?
Now, as Teresa continued walking Marco through the records, one document led to another. Government correspondence led to academic papers led to conference presentations led to books. Yet, throughout all of it, according to the records Teresa had uncovered, Kentler had personally supported placing boys, young males, into the same foster provider's care. Fritz Hinkle, which was Marco's foster father. The thing is, this may not seem like a big deal in and of itself, but the problem that started to become crystal clear was that there were complaints about Hinkle. And those complaints were primarily that he was inappropriate with children, that he seemed to pay too much attention to little boys. But the placements continued over and over and over again. Records were revealing that Helmut Kentler defended Fritz Hinkle and reassured officials that the placements should continue. Now, we've got to stop and think to ourselves, why on earth would a psychologist central to the placement of foster children continuously advocate for a man who is steadily getting lists of complaints? Well, what Teresa started to find out was this happened again and again, and not just with Fritz Hinkle. It wasn't limited to just one foster home. This was happening in multiple other homes where Kentler oversaw multiple placements involving other men and similar complaints surfacing as well. At first, Marco thought it was a mistake, and I think that's probably a pretty normal reaction to something like that. Perhaps Kentler was misunderstood. Perhaps journalists had exaggerated, or, maybe even the documents were being taken out of context. Because, after all, Helmut Kentler had spent decades studying children. He wasn't just this self-published guy. He was probably a tenured professor. And he had not only studied children, but he also studied families and education, and had built his career advocating for that population, right? The population of children. Surely there had to be another explanation. Why would one of Germany's leading child psychologists repeatedly again, advocate for the same foster parents despite growing concerns.
As researchers examined Kentler's published work, they started to realize the answers to these questions had been there all along. It wasn't buried in secret government files or hidden in private correspondences. Kentler literally had written about it himself. In fact, Helmut Kentler believed that certain boys, especially boys who had experienced neglect, unstable homes, or behavioral problems, needed affection more than anything else. So far, doesn't sound particularly controversial, but then his theory took a turn that almost defies belief. Kentler then argued that men who were sexually attracted to boys could actually make ideal foster fathers. Not despite that attraction, but because of it. He believed that those men would become deeply attached to the children in their care, that they would invest emotionally in them, that they would be less likely to abandon them than other foster parents. So, in other words, the very characteristic that should have permanently disqualified these foster parents from caring for children became, to Kentler, the reason they should. And so suddenly, with this realization, everything Teresa had uncovered started to make sense. Why Kentler repeatedly defended Fritz Hinkle, why complaints didn't automatically end the placements, why concerns from teachers and professionals weren't enough to remove children from those homes. This wasn't a psychologist overlooking warning signs. This was a psychologist who used what we call warning signs and as indicators for placement. Fritz Hinkle hadn't somehow slipped through the cracks of the child welfare system as a pedophile. In Helmut Kentler's eyes, Fritz Hinkle had been exactly the kind of foster father that Helmut was looking for.
I think that there are obviously lots of questions already stirring in everybody's minds. But I think the biggest one for me listening to this is, how could this happen? Right? I just don't feel like any logical person would go along with this. And, furthermore, how could a renowned expert convince every layer of the foster care system that pedophiles would be the best foster parents for vulnerable foster children? I mean, Bailey, these are marginalized. I mean, kids are already marginalized, right? Like they're already, but I mean,
Well, yeah,
this
they're
is
vulnerable.
this is
They're vulnerable.
kind of a double whammy situation. And in our naivety, we think, wow, how did everyone miss this? But as Teresa Nentwig continued walking Marco through decades of records, a different picture began to emerge. It wasn't that everyone missed it. People absolutely noticed things. Questions were absolutely raised, and concerns were recorded and scattered endlessly through the files. So, no, it definitely wasn't missed. It was just that nothing was being done about it. One of the most revealing parts of the investigation wasn't discovering that warning signs existed. It was discovering what happened after they appeared. So, again and again, officials documented concerns only for the placements to continue, right? Like it just seemed like someone was looking at this stuff saying duly noted and moving along, right? Like nothing was happening. Files moved from one desk to another, reports were written, meetings were held, recommendations were made, right? All of these boxes are being checked, but that final box, right, that do not place them here or remove them from that home, that is the box that was never being checked. And somewhere inside that machinery, the momentum of the system always seemed to push in the same direction, which was forward, right? It wasn't backwards or, a 180-degree turn or my gosh, even a 90-degree turn. Let's at least start turning this boat around. But it wasn't. It was just full steam ahead.
Right. Yeah. I think this is the stupidest and wildest thing. And Helmut, obviously, the psychologist obviously had issues with little children as well, because there's no way a, a typical developing brain would be like, yeah, just because they're sexually attracted to them doesn't mean that they're going to do anything with them. They're just going to give them lots of love and attention. And it's
Well, and
sick.
that was kind of
You know
my
what I mean?
question is it makes me wonder if he was in the camp of just like, these men are not going to act on it. If anything, they're going to realize that these boys are boys that need to be protected. And so therefore it will transform into this all loving, all nurturing, never going, you know what I mean? Like,
No.
like, is that the camp he was living in? I don't know, because it's really hard for me to rationalize that.
Yeah. No, I just think that he knew, personally. I really do. That's just my personal opinion. I don't know. And the thing that strikes me about the little children, the little boys in this case is what keeps kind of coming to my brain is we've been talking about trauma, but I keep thinking about these boys in the system being placed with literal pedophile foster parents. Trauma, obviously, from that, and we're going to get into that. But the other piece when it comes to like systematic issues and the foster system is trauma does not always require like active cruelty. Unfortunately, it can also really grow in the gaps created, uh, like when the people who are responsible for protecting the child never intervenes, right? For every child, every day that passes, especially in the situation without an adult stepping in, I mean, what that starts to teach, the proverbial child in this case is the same lesson. This must be normal, right? If the teachers know, if the caseworkers know, if the courts know, if the government knows, then maybe this is just how life works. And I feel like once a child reaches that conclusion, that is so damaging. And the damage really extends even further than the actual acts of abuse, right? So their entire understanding of trust is fundamentally altered. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and I think what's ironic is that you had used the word abandoned, right? That he didn't want these children to be abandoned. And what you're describing to me sounds like the ultimate form of abandonment. Being in a place, being exposed to, alleged abuse and thinking all these people know and nobody is coming to my rescue. And that to me would seem like the ultimate feeling of abandonment. Like I've been left all by
Yeah.
myself to, to fight this fight. It really is awful. And one of a kind of on another thought, right? One of the concepts that sociologists talk about is something called normalization. And this is such a fascinating thing for me. And Bailey, you kind of touched on that a little bit. And that's that it's the process by which something that would shock us in isolation gradually becomes accepted simply because it continues happening. And I think that all of us experience this, especially like if you meet in-laws for the first time, or if you meet some other family that you're not exposed to, and you're just kind of looking around like, why is everybody thinking that this is totally normal? And I think that's, a very mild example of that. I mean, it just becomes normal, right? The things that you do and the process that you go through. And if you think about how many institutional scandals follow that pattern, it really is pretty sickening. Rarely does an organization wake up one morning and collectively decide to abandon its values, right? And I think that's a lot of times what people think happened. Like it was just some awful big twist. And we talk about this so often in cases, but it really is, it's those baby steps. It's like, it's okay. And we're going to turn a blind eye to this. We'll sweep that under the rug. And over time, the boundaries move a little bit further away, right? And ethics start slipping a little bit further down that hill. And someone makes an exception, right? Someone signs off on paperwork because an expert endorsed it. And the next person assumes that the previous person already asked the difficult questions. And before long, no individual decision seems catastrophic, but together they create a system that's capable of extraordinary harm. And that really is such a scary but a realistic thought on how important the individual is, right? How you always should have a voice in that system. And that's what struck Teresa and Marco about the Kentler case. There was no single document that they could find that fully explained the unbelievable patterns. There weren't formal memos or policies found outlining these recommendations. Instead, it was dozens of ordinary yet fragmented bureaucratic decisions. It was literally a recommendation here or a placement there, and a favorable evaluation, like, yeah, that one passed, we'll let that slide. A renewal, a case left open, another child assigned, another signature. The list goes on and on. And institutional failures, are just that. They're built this way, not through one decision, but just these hundreds of little signatures here and there, these little just decisions. They're little actions that make big trauma. After all, Kentler's ideas circulated within broader professional networks, right? He wasn't an outlier necessarily. He had people who followed him and who agreed with him. Other academics, child welfare officials, and professionals interacted with those ideas, right? They were bumping into them on a daily basis. And, sometimes they would accept them. Now, sometimes it was not necessarily that they were accepting them, but they were failing to challenge them. And then sometimes they were allowing them to influence practice. So in other words, the scandal wasn't sustained by one influential professor. It was sustained by an environment that gave his influence room to grow. In a weird way, it really does take a village. And I mean that in the opposite of how we think of like the positive, it takes a village. I think in this case, it does take a village to make something like this happen, in the worst kind of ways.
Yeah. It's, there's good old Chelsea bringing in the sociological shit show to back up the psychological shit show, right? So kind of back to the Kentler experiment. If you've ever looked back, any of us, if we've ever looked back on our childhood as an adult, there's usually moments where we realize something wasn't exactly what we thought it was. As we get older, we all reinterpret our childhood through different lenses, adult lenses. Unfortunately, what happened to Marco was more extreme than that, more extreme than a simple shift in perspective. Until Teresa Nentlig had contacted him, Marco believed that he understood what had happened. I mean, and it was kind of simple. His mother really struggled. The government intervened. He was placed in foster care, like countless of other children, and that he believed he just had a really bad misfortune of ending up in a bad situation. That story made sense. But now, after teaming up with Teresa and reading through all these files, suddenly that explanation was collapsing and it was showing a more horrific truth. His foster father, Fritz Hinkle, wasn't an accidental placement, right? In fact, people within Berlin's child welfare system knew exactly who Hinkle was. They knew he was a man sexually interested in boys. And Helmut Kentler not only knew that, but advocated for that as well. Fritz Hinkle continued serving as a foster father for years, like almost 30 years, from the early 1970s until 2003. And during that time, you guys, multiple boys, including Marco, passed through this home under the supervision of Berlin's child welfare system. And I want you just to really think about that. 30 years. For 30 whole ass years, vulnerable foster children entered into a pedophile's home, placed there by the country's leading psychologist who believed in his experiment wholly. In a report to the Berlin Senate in 1988, Kentler even described the foster care project as a full success. He didn't write it as though something had gone wrong. He didn't express concerns that vulnerable children might have been harmed in the homes of literal pedophiles. Instead, he pointed to the placements as evidence supporting his ideas. And this, our dear listeners, was literally what the Kentler experiment was.
And so once Marco understood that the Kentler experiment, what it actually was, he found himself returning to memories he'd spent years trying not to think about. And again, I feel like that's a pretty normal next step. And like Bailey had talked about, these memories, they didn't come back in order. Very, very rarely do they ever come back as smooth, like you rewind the VHS tape. For those of us who grew up in the 90s, you don't rewind it and then just start it from the beginning and see it all the way through as a linear thing. They surfaced one at a time. In a weird way, it's almost like, a TikToks, like doom scrolling, like you're just randomly getting these, flashes of memories. And, each one attached itself to something that Teresa Nentwig had uncovered in the archives. So every new document seemed to explain a memory that had never quite made sense. One of the first things Marco realized was that he'd misunderstood Helmut Kentler's role in his life. As a child, Marco now remembered visiting Kentler with Fritz Hinkle. He remembered long drives to Kentler's home. At the time, Marco assumed Kentler was simply another psychologist involved in his case. Foster children meet psychologists, evaluators. They meet lots of experts who are supposed to make sure that they're safe. Looking back, Marco realized that wasn't what was happening at all. Kentler wasn't independently evaluating Fritz Hinkle or checking to see whether Marco was safe. Kentler, the man Marco believed was protecting him, was ensuring Marco's placement with a pedophile foster father. Upon new revelations, and as Marco continued to revisit his teenage years, another memory suddenly made sense. Around puberty, he had become determined to get stronger, right? Which, again, that's a pretty normal thing. Every day he lifted weights. But the thing with Marco is that he was obsessed, right? He didn't just want to get stronger. He was obsessed with getting stronger and stronger. Looking back, Marco realized he hadn't been training for sports or fitness. He had been preparing to defend himself. And if that is not just the most gut-wrenching thought, to think of a teenage boy training to fight off a predator, I don't know. Like, it gives me literal chills. One night, when Marco was under Hinkle's care, Hinkle tried to fondle him. Marco reacted instinctively. He slapped Hinkle's hand away, surprising Hinkle, and stopped the sexual abuse. Hinkle never again attempted to sexually molest Marco, but his behavior morphed instantly. Hinkle became increasingly hostile and physically abusive. Hinkle beat Marco and would lock him out of the kitchen so Marco couldn't get food during the night. Hinkle beat Marco repeatedly and would tell him, "I'm not hitting you." Oh, Bailey, this is your favorite type. "I'm hitting the devil inside of you." And for years, Marco had remembered those moments as disconnected pieces of a difficult childhood. Now, with this new information, they fit together. Hinkel's sexual abuse had stopped because Marco fought back. The violence, however, didn't. And in fact, it escalated.
While Marco was reconstructing his own memories, Teresa was reconstructing the official record. The two stories began to overlap in really eerie and awful ways. The archives showed that concerns about Fritz Hinkel had not emerged years later with the benefit of hindsight. They were surfacing while children were still living in his home. One teacher described Hinkel as someone who was, quote, always looking for contact with boys. Later, a caseworker documented what appeared to be a full-on sexual relationship between Hinkel and one of his foster sons. When I say sexual relationship, that was how they worded it. Obviously, this is sexual abuse, rape, molestation, whatever you want to give to it, because children cannot consent to that. Those concerns were serious enough that authorities opened a formal criminal investigation. But instead, what happened after the investigation was opened is Helmut Kentler intervened. Surprise, surprise. He wrote an expert opinion defending Fritz Hinkel. He challenged the concerns that had been raised and criticized by the psychologist who had also believed the boys were being harmed. And Kentler's opinion carried enough influence that the investigation was simply suspended. Hinkel remained an improved foster father, and boys continued to be placed in his home. And again, you guys, this went on for 30 fucking years. And Kentler continued in his belief that his experiment was a success, all while countless foster children were being abused and molested by their foster parent, a dynamic that had literally been controlled entirely by Helmut Kentler.
Unfortunately, for decades, the Kentler experiment remained largely forgotten. Helmut Kentler died in 2008, still regarded as one of Germany's most influential expert on sex education and child development. Gag me with a literal spoon. It wasn't until years later, after journalists and researchers began digging through archived records, that the full scope of what had happened started coming into focus. Thank goodness, seriously, for people like Teresa Nentwig and her research. I mean, that really is what helped reopen questions or really even start formulating, that's what I'm looking for, formulating questions about this case and about this experiment that had been buried for decades. And survivors like Marco came forward for the first time. What investigators initially believed was a small, long-forgotten experiment gradually revealed itself to be something much larger. Independent investigations commissioned by the Berlin Senate and later by universities concluded that Kentler's influence reached far beyond a handful of foster placements, and that multiple institutions had played a role in allowing the practice to continue.
As the findings became public, Germany was forced to confront a chapter of its child welfare history that many people had never heard of. I know that people aren't perfect and countries aren't perfect, but for fuck's sake, Germany, like, you know what I mean?
Come on, Bailey. A lot of countries.
At this point, you can't even be mad. You can't even be mad that people look at you some type of way sometimes because shit, you know what I mean? So, in 2020, the Berlin Senator for Education described the Kentler experiment as, quote, a crime in state responsibility. So, yes, kudos to that guy for saying, this is our country's responsibility. We dropped the ball. The Berlin government promised financial compensation for surviving victims. Shout out, kudos there. And additional investigations were launched into Kentler's work in the institutions that enabled it. But even after all of this, after all the investigations, there were no dramatic arrests, no courtroom where Marco could watch someone be held accountable for what happened to him. Helmut Kentler had been dead for years before the scandal broke. Many of the officials involved had retired or died. And for survivors, the reckoning came decades after their childhoods were already over.
And maybe that's the hardest part of this story. When we think about true crime, we usually expect justice to arrive in this final act, right? This gusto, kind of a standing ovation type of ending. And, the detectives, they solved the case. They looked into this stuff, but unfortunately there were no juries that, were giving out a verdict. There was nobody that was really ultimately being held responsible. The Kentler experiment doesn't, it's just, it doesn't leave a good taste in your mouth. I'm not going to use that. That's a terrible saying. The Kentler experiment really is just unsettling. The ending, I mean, I feel like from the beginning to the end, the fact that it just doesn't end the way that we want it to, with justice being served and life sentences being handed out to these pedophiles, to these abusers. It just ends with a stack of government files, a handful of survivors who finally learned they weren't alone. And one sentence written by the architect of the experiment that still echoes through every page of the story, he called it a quote unquote complete success. I don't, maybe we have varying definitions on a complete success, but that's absolutely not what how I would describe this. Maybe the real lessons of this case isn't how one psychologist came to believe something so profoundly wrong. Maybe it's how long it took everyone else to finally say that he was.
And that's the shit experiment, the Kentler experiment. And I hate myself for even choosing this and putting it together. But yeah, you cannot tell me, I will die on the hill, of anybody that's like, well, maybe it really was like a good hypothesis. Maybe, like, I understand where his mentality was coming from, that like grown men who were sexually attracted to little boys would be the best providers of nurturing care and attachment to them. I'm like, no, nobody thinks that way except people who share the same qualities. You get what I'm saying? So you guys mute the next 10 seconds if you're riding with a child. I should have given you warnings back in the episode. Hashtag fuck, fuck, Helmut, and fuck, Hinkle. Fuck them all.
Yeah.
I hate this.
Yeah. Again, I talked about this briefly at lunch, and I really feel that the best reaction to it was what everybody did. And that was just one of those, like, literally everybody just looked at me, like put their head back slightly, and they were just like, what? How is this a real thing? I don't know. And I told everybody at lunch, I was like, guys, this right here, when people get aggravated with the hoops that, you have to jump through in a system, and like all of this red tape that's put around, really anything, dental, medical, fields of mental health, all of it seems to have all of these protocols and precaution. But it's because of cases like this, right? Because we have cases that were so horrendous that it really kind of ruins it for things that are working in a normal realm, right? So now it's like we have to document everything, and we have to do all of this stuff that's such a headache for so many people, and people get so frustrated with it. But this is why, if you're wondering why all of these things are in place and why you have to sign so many dotted lines, I mean, in a weird way, you might want to be thankful that hopefully we are learning from this and it's stopping.
Yeah. Hashtag hopefully. Yeah. That's
Bailey's
all I
like,
have to
I said
say
what I
about
had to
this.
say. It's if y'all.
F you, you're cool. F you. That's how I feel about this whole case. And Germany, y'all,
Bailey, Germany had a hard time.
y'all.
They had a hard go of it. And they got better.
I mean,
I
but I
got
got
better.
better. I mean, dude, I don't know. Germany, y'all have had a hard knock life. And I don't know. There's a whole lot there. Y'all need, if there was ever a country that needed like countrywide, uh, like cognitive behavioral
The whole
therapy.
country needs EMDR. The whole lot of them.
Yeah, and CBT and DBT and ACT and all of it. They just need all of it. And I'm kind of over it right now. I'm kind of mad at Germany right now. So just let me be in my feels. What's that song? I just want to be mad for a while.
I know.
That's how I feel. So, on that, you guys, thanks for hanging out with us through this shitty wild ride of a ride.
And as always, we'll catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators.